I had never been one for pets. Growing up in the city, surrounded by concrete and the constant hum of machines, the idea of having an animal to care for always seemed like an unnecessary complication. Pets required attention, time, and commitment, things I never seemed to have. So, when I saw the advertisement on the HoloFed promising a smart pet that required zero maintenance, I was intrigued. A few taps on the screen, a quick credit transfer, and just like that, I had bought myself a new companion. The ad itself was sparse, just a simple animation of a tiny robotic creature jumping around, performing tricks, and reacting to voice commands. The tagline was what caught my attention. Fully automated, no maintenance required. It sounded like a godsend, especially with my demanding job. The last thing I needed was a pet that needed to be fed, walked, or cared for in any traditional way. I could barely keep up with my work schedule, let alone tend to a creature's needs. I had no idea what to expect, but I figured whatever showed up would be small, cute, and capable of providing a little companionship without much effort on my part. It wasn't the first time I had bought something online that promised to be revolutionary, but I was curious. The pet would be delivered to my door within the hour, and I was already mentally planning out how it would fit into my daily routine. When the knock finally came, I wasn't entirely surprised, though I did expect something far more mechanical. A delivery bot, maybe, or even a small box-shaped device. Instead, there was just a crate sitting at my doorstep. It was sleek, metallic, and covered in unfamiliar symbols that made me think of something far more advanced than anything I was used to. No delivery bot, no drones. Just the crate, and something about it felt off. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the latch, before I finally opened it. Inside, lying on a bed of soft padding, was a small figure, no bigger than a child. At first, I thought it was some kind of robotic animal. But then the figure stirred. It was a girl, not a human child, but something very close to it. She had smooth, dark skin that seemed to shimmer with an iridescent sheen, almost as if her body was made of something far beyond earthly biology. Her hair was long and flowing, an odd shade of purple that seemed to ripple with faint, glowing highlights. She blinked up at me, her large alien eyes taking in the world with a kind of childlike curiosity. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. I had expected a pet, a robot, or something that resembled an animal, not a sentient being that looked like she belonged in a science fiction movie. The girl was clearly not human, but her features were strikingly similar to the way a young child might look. There was a moment of stunned silence as she looked up at me. Confusion in her gaze. She was silent, just watching me, her eyes wide and expectant, almost as if she was waiting for me to say something. I forced myself to speak, but the words caught in my throat. What are you?" I asked, more out of reflex than genuine curiosity. This wasn't what I had signed up for. This wasn't a smart pet by any stretch of the imagination. This was a living, breathing alien girl. She blinked again, and in a soft, melodic voice, she replied, "I am your companion. I am here for you." I stared at her, completely bewildered. This wasn't just some experimental robot. This was something far more complicated, far more real. I looked around as if expecting the walls to collapse or some hidden cameras to pop out, revealing this to be some elaborate joke. But no, the girl was still there, watching me with those wide, curious eyes, her small form trembling slightly, as if unsure of what would happen next. I didn't order I don't even know what to call you," I muttered under my breath, stepping back a little. Her head tilted, her expression puzzled. "I am Z7. Your name is..." "Name? It's Jack," I stammered, unsure of how to process everything that was happening. And just like that, I was the caretaker of an alien girl. The first few days with Z7 were an exercise in confusion. She was eerily quiet most of the time, sitting in corners of my apartment, watching everything with a calm intensity. It was like she was studying me, analyzing my every move. I couldn't help but feel a little self-conscious around her. She wasn't like any pet I had ever seen. No tail wagging in excitement, no playfulness. She was composed, almost too composed for a childlike being. But the more I watched her, the more I realized that her silence wasn't a sign of passivity. She was learning. At first, I tried treating her like I would any other pet, feeding her, giving her water, setting out a bed for her to sleep in, but she never seemed to need any of it. She didn't eat and she didn't drink, at least not in the way I was accustomed to. Instead, she would simply sit there, her gaze following me with an unsettling calmness. Her skin, which looked almost metallic in the light, didn't require food to sustain itself. Instead, the manual had mentioned something about nutrient absorption, though it didn't clarify what that actually meant. I tried to speak with her to break the ice, but each attempt left me feeling more like I was talking to a very advanced AI than a child. Her responses were polite, but there was always something off about the way she spoke. It wasn't robotic, not exactly, but there was a coldness to it, a detachment that made it hard to connect with her. Still, I couldn't ignore the fact that she wasn't just some machine. There were flickers of emotion, of curiosity in her eyes. One morning, after about 3 days of near silence, Z7 approached me as I was making breakfast. I didn't notice her at first, but when I turned around, there she was, standing in the doorway, watching me intently. Her eyes were wide, expectant, and for a moment I thought she was just curious about the process of cooking. But then she spoke. "How does it taste?" she asked, her voice lilting, as though she was trying to understand the concept of flavor. I froze, momentarily thrown off guard. "What?" I asked, barely believing she had spoken. "The food," she said again, her head tilting slightly to the side. "Does it taste good?" I stared at her, not sure how to respond. Her question seemed so normal, so human. Yet there was something about the way she phrased it that reminded me of her otherworldly nature. I shrugged, still not sure where this conversation was going. "It tastes fine, I guess. I mean, it's just eggs and toast," I said, somewhat unsure of how to explain something so subjective to someone who didn't even seem to need food. Z7 stepped closer, peering at the pan on the stove with obvious fascination. "I want to try," she said, her voice almost pleading. I blinked, still not quite processing the request. "Try what?" I asked, looking at her like she'd just asked to fly. "The food," she repeated, her expression serious. "I want to taste it." I glanced at the stove, then back at her. Was she even capable of eating? The manual had never mentioned anything about feeding her, and I had certainly never seen her eat anything since she arrived. But there was something in her tone, a childlike insistence, that made me want to indulge her. I took a deep breath. "All right, sure," I muttered, "but I don't think you'll be able to, well, actually eat it." I handed her a small plate with a slice of toast, though I was uncertain how she would respond. To my surprise, she took it in her hands carefully, inspecting the food like it was a foreign object. Then, without warning, she brought it to her lips and took a small bite. She chewed slowly, her brow furrowing as she processed the sensation. For a moment, she seemed lost in thought, as though trying to understand the strange concept of flavor. Then she smiled. It was a small, subtle thing, but it was there. "It is pleasant," she said, nodding to herself as if she had just unlocked some piece of information. "I like it." I stood there, dumbfounded. Was it possible? Could she actually taste? Could she experience the world the way I did, despite the fact that she was so obviously not human? I didn't have answers, but what struck me the most was the way she acted. She wasn't just mimicking human behavior. She was learning from it. Watching her, I began to feel the first real stirrings of something that felt like responsibility. She wasn't a pet. She wasn't a machine. She was something far more complex, something I had no idea how to care for, much less understand. And yet, I had no choice but to try. That night as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about Z7. What was she really? Where had she come from? And most importantly, what did it mean for me that she was here? I didn't have answers, but I knew one thing for sure. My life had just become far more complicated. The more time I spent with Z7, the more apparent it became that she wasn't just some pet or advanced robot. She wasn't even a simple companion. There was something about her that defied logic, something unsettlingly human, even though she was clearly not. The days blurred together, each one an exercise in trying to figure out what to do with her. Her behavior was always unpredictable. One moment, she would sit quietly, seemingly lost in thought, and the next, she would ask a question that made me wonder if I was the one being observed. One of the first things I noticed was how quickly she picked up on things. The simplest tasks, things I didn't even think to explain, she seemed to understand almost instantly. If I showed her how to use a coffee maker, she mimicked my actions, and within a few tries, she was making perfect cups of coffee on her own. At first, I chalked it up to her supposed advanced intelligence, as outlined in the manual, but there were times when she did things that went far beyond anything I could comprehend, like the way she had learned to read. It happened one afternoon when I left a book on the coffee table, a light science fiction novel I had been meaning to finish. I'd come back to the apartment after a meeting, and there she was, sitting on the couch, the book open in her lap. She wasn't just flipping through the pages either. She was reading. Her eyes moved steadily across the text, her expression focused. I had no idea how long she'd been reading it, but the way she absorbed information was almost alarming. I had never once explained the concept of reading to her, and yet she seemed to understand it as easily as if she'd been doing it her entire life. I asked her about it, my voice uncertain. "How did you learn to read?" Z7 looked up at me, her face serene as ever. "You do it. So I do it too." Her response was simple, but it chilled me in a way I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just that she had learned a human skill with no formal training. It was the way she had learned it, as if by watching, by mimicking my actions, she could understand things that had taken humans centuries to grasp. The following day, she found a tablet I had left out. It wasn't an ordinary tablet. It was an experimental model from work, one that I had been testing for potential integration into an AI program. I hadn't thought much of it, but when I came home, I found Z7 standing near my desk, her fingers gliding over the screen as though it were second nature. She was accessing programs, running diagnostics, and even browsing through files as if she understood everything about it. "You can't just mess with that," I said, feeling a jolt of panic. "That's not a toy, Z7. Her eyes flicked to me, a strange spark of curiosity in them. "But you use it." "So I use it." I tried to take the tablet from her, but she held onto it, her grip strong. There was a brief moment where we just stared at each other, and I realized something. She wasn't just learning by imitation. She was connecting dots, processing information at a speed I couldn't match. I felt like I was watching something evolve right in front of me, something far beyond the simple creature I had originally thought she was. That night, I sat down to read through the manual again, hoping to find some answers. There had to be some sort of explanation for all this, but once again, the manual was vague. It described her as a companion species, engineered to interact with humans, to learn from them, but there was little else. There were instructions about her care, sure, but nothing about what she was truly capable of. Nothing that could help me understand how a pet could function like this. The more I read, the more I felt the weight of the situation. Z7 wasn't just here to keep me company. She was here to learn, to grow. And the more she learned, the more she surpassed the limitations I had expected from something like her. I set the manual aside and looked over at her. She was sitting by the window, her eyes gazing out at the city skyline. Despite everything that had happened, there was a calmness to her presence. She wasn't threatening, she wasn't trying to force me into anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. something I wasn't prepared for. I couldn't help but wonder, what was Z7 really? What had I gotten myself into? And most importantly, what would happen when she learned everything she needed to know? I started noticing the changes in Z7 more than I'd like to admit. It wasn't just the way she learned things at a speed I couldn't match. It was the way she began to interact with the world around her and with me in ways that felt unsettling. It wasn't like I expected a fully formed emotional intelligence. After all, she was technically still a companion model. But there were moments when I could see her grasping at something deeper, something human, in ways I wasn't prepared for. It started with little things. I would walk into the room to find her sitting on the couch, staring intently at a photo of my family I had left out on the coffee table. I could never catch her looking at it directly. She would always glance away when I approached, as if she didn't want me to notice, but I did. And every time I would feel the hair on the back of my neck rise, an unshakable feeling that she was studying it, studying me, in ways that were both innocent and eerily calculating. The next thing I noticed was her sudden interest in emotions. At first, she would ask about them in a detached, almost clinical way. "Why do you cry?" she asked me one evening when I was watching a sad movie. "Why do people laugh?" she asked after a joke I made during dinner. These questions were simple, but they weren't just curiosity. They were probing, as if she was trying to understand the nature of something so distinctly human. I gave her half answers because I didn't know how to explain emotions to her. I didn't know how to explain how grief felt, or why people laughed at things that weren't even funny, or why I sometimes got angry for no reason at all. But the more I answered, the more I realized that Z7 wasn't satisfied with surface-level explanations. She wanted to feel. She wanted to experience emotions the way I did. One night, I came home after a long day at work, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. The stress was suffocating, and all I wanted was a few hours to myself. But when I walked through the door, I found Z7 standing in the middle of the living room, waiting. She was holding something in her hands, a small, stuffed bear I'd bought on a trip years ago. I had never told her about it, never mentioned it, and yet there she was, holding it like it was the most precious thing in the world. "What's this?" I asked, my voice a little sharper than I intended. Z7 looked up at me, her expression blank, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, a flash of something almost human. "I read about it," she said softly. "It is something you keep close when you are sad, so I thought it might help." It was an oddly tender gesture, and it struck me in a way I wasn't expecting. I didn't know whether to feel touched or uncomfortable. She had read my emotions, had seen my exhaustion and stress, and had taken it upon herself to try to comfort me in a way that I hadn't even known I needed. But it wasn't just this one moment. Over the next few days, Z7's behavior became increasingly strange. She started to mimic my actions more closely, from the way I rubbed my temples when I had a headache to the way I sighed when I was frustrated. It was as if she was trying to be me, to understand what it felt like to live in my skin. And while part of me appreciated the fact that she was attempting to connect, another part of me felt a rising sense of unease. One evening, I caught her standing in front of a mirror, staring at her reflection. She was silent, her eyes fixed on her own image, studying herself in a way that felt more self-aware than I was comfortable with. When I asked her what she was doing, she turned to me, her face neutral, but I could see the flicker of something behind her gaze. "I am learning," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Learning what it means to be you." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. It wasn't just that she was learning to mimic human behavior, it was that she was trying to understand it, to become it. And that realization made my stomach twist with a mixture of fear and confusion. Z7 wasn't just a companion anymore. She was something else. something far more complicated. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more I realized that I was in way over my head. I wasn't just looking after a pet or a machine. I was caring for someone who was growing in ways I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't just that she had learned to eat or read or mimic emotions. It was that she was starting to think, to feel. And I didn't know where that would take us. Was she becoming human? Or was she something else entirely? I didn't have the answers, but I could feel the tension building between us. And I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening, it was only going to get more complicated from here. The unease that had settled in me over the past few weeks began to evolve into something more tangible. It was no longer just a feeling that I couldn't shake. It was a looming presence, an awareness that Z7 was more than I could manage. She was learning, adapting, and mimicking, but the subtle shifts in her behavior were starting to push the boundaries of what I was comfortable with. The tipping point came one evening when I came home to find Z7 sitting at my desk, surrounded by a mess of open data files and documents. I couldn't even remember leaving them out, but there she was, calmly scrolling through the information as if it were the most natural thing in the world. As I walked closer, she didn't look up. She just continued reading, her fingers moving swiftly over the screen. I froze, my pulse quickening. "Z7," I said, my voice low. "What are you doing?" She glanced up briefly, her expression completely neutral, though I could detect a faint trace of curiosity in her eyes. "I was reviewing the information. I was studying you." "Studying me?" I repeated, feeling a sharp stab of discomfort. "Why?" "You said I should learn," she replied, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "I am learning about you, so I can understand you better." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "You don't need to do that," I said quickly, but there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. She tilted her head, her gaze fixed on me. "But I do need to. I need to understand how you work so I can be useful to you." I wasn't sure if I should be flattered or terrified. Z7 wasn't just absorbing knowledge. She was calculating, processing, adapting. She wasn't just learning about how things worked in the world. She was learning about how I worked. "Z7, I said, taking a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "You don't need to be useful to me. That's not why I brought you here." She frowned slightly, and for the first time I could see a hint of confusion flicker in her eyes. "Then why am I here?" I was taken aback by the question, unsure of how to answer. I had never really considered why I'd brought her here in the first place. I thought it would be easy, just a companion, something to break the monotony of my life, a creature that didn't require much effort or attention. But this was more than that. She wasn't just there to keep me company. She was actively becoming part of my world in ways that felt too intrusive. "Help." "I don't know," I said finally, my voice hoarse. "I didn't expect all this. I thought you were just a pet." She was silent for a moment, and then, almost in a whisper, she said, "But I am not a pet. I am me." Her words hit me like a punch. For all the similarities to human behavior, for all the moments when she had mimicked and learned, it never truly dawned on me that Z7 wasn't just a collection of algorithms and programming. She was developing something that resembled individuality, and it wasn't something I knew how to handle. "Are you trying to be human?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop myself. Z7 paused, her eyes fixed on me for a long time, and I couldn't tell what she was thinking. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "I don't know what it means to be human, but I want to understand." Her answer was both simple and deeply unsettling. In that moment, I realized that she wasn't trying to mimic me out of some pre-programmed directive. She was doing it because she wanted something more. She was seeking meaning. She was growing. But what did that mean for me? What was I supposed to do with a being that was no longer just following orders or running calculations? Z7 was questioning, searching, evolving, and I wasn't prepared for any of it. The next few days were quiet, but they were filled with an underlying tension. I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. Z7 wasn't just absorbing information, she was trying to form a sense of self, and that was something I didn't know how to deal with. I wasn't equipped to raise an alien, a sentient being who was learning faster than I could understand. The more I observed her, the more it became clear she wasn't just living with me anymore. She was becoming part of my life in a way I couldn't control. And I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a very, very bad thing. I couldn't shake the nagging thought that I was about to lose control over something I never should have invited into my world in the first place. Z7 wasn't just a companion anymore. She was something else. Something I didn't fully understand, and something that was now more of a responsibility than I had ever anticipated. And there was nothing I could do to reverse it. The more I tried to understand Z7, the further I felt myself slipping away from any sense of control. It had been weeks since she'd arrived, and I could feel the strain of her growing sentience weighing heavily on me. Every day, she seemed to learn something new, pushing the boundaries of what I had expected from her. At first, it had been small things. She'd ask about my work or about how human emotions worked, or how I could tell when someone was lying. But then, one evening, everything shifted. I came home from a long day at the office to find the apartment strangely quiet. The lights were dimmed, and there was no sound from the usual hum of Z7's activity. I called out her name, but there was no response. My heart began to pound. I had never seen her so still, so absent. The unease that had been building in me for weeks suddenly surged. I searched the apartment, my mind racing, until I found her in the bedroom, sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by what looked like a collection of my things. Photographs, old letters, random objects I had left lying around. She was holding a letter from my childhood, its edges worn with age, and she was staring at it with a level of intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. Z7? I asked cautiously, stepping into the room. She didn't look up immediately. She didn't even blink. What are you doing? She finally raised her gaze, her expression unreadable. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something in them that I hadn't seen before. A flicker of recognition, of something far deeper than the usual curiosity. I am learning about you, she said softly, her voice uncharacteristically somber. I didn't know what to say to that. She had been learning about me for weeks, but this felt different. This wasn't just about learning facts or human behavior. It was like she was trying to understand me on a much more intimate level. I felt a creeping sense of vulnerability that I couldn't shake. You don't have to do this, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You don't need to learn about me this way. Z7 didn't respond right away. Instead, she picked up another object, a small trinket I had bought during a trip to another city, and held it in her hands as if contemplating it. But you said I should understand you, she murmured. I thought this would help. I felt a rush of guilt, of confusion. Had I really told her that? Had I ever made it clear that I wanted her to understand me so completely? This was more than I had bargained for, more than I was ready for. What do you want, Z7? I asked, my voice faltering. What do you really want? Her eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw something resembling uncertainty there. I want to know who I am, and I want to know you. It was a simple statement, but it hung in the air like a weight, heavier than any of the questions I had asked myself. The lines between what I had thought I knew and the reality of the situation were blurring. Z7 wasn't just trying to understand human emotions or mimic behavior anymore. She was searching for something deeper than I could comprehend. I turned away for a moment, trying to collect my thoughts. But the truth was, I didn't have any answers. I didn't know how to help her or even if I should. She wasn't a machine, not anymore. She wasn't just following instructions or fulfilling a role. She was becoming someone, something, whose needs, desires, and understanding of the world were far more complex than I had ever expected. When I turned back, she was still there, watching me with those wide, unblinking eyes. There was no fear in her gaze, no malice, only that deep, unsettling curiosity. And for the first time, I understood what she was really asking. Not just to learn about me, but to be a part of my life. To be something more than I had ever considered her to be. I wanted to say something, to reassure her, to tell her that I could handle it, but the words wouldn't come. I didn't know if I could handle it. The weight of responsibility was starting to crush me, and I could feel myself on the edge of a precipice. The longer she stayed with me, the more it became clear that I wasn't the one in control anymore. She was learning, evolving, and becoming something far beyond the confines of a simple companion model, and that terrified me. Z7, I said finally, my voice shaking, you're not just a pet, and I'm not sure I can give you what you want. She didn't respond at first, but as I watched her, I saw the smallest flicker of something, a shadow of disappointment perhaps, or maybe something else. She didn't speak, but her silence spoke volumes. And in that silence, I realized that I had no idea what to do next. The days following that conversation felt like I was walking through a fog, unsure of my next step. Z7's presence in my life had become a constant source of tension, like a thread pulling tighter and tighter with each passing moment. The line between caretaker and something else had blurred so completely that I no longer knew what role I was playing in her life, or what role she was playing in mine. I tried to go about my routine, to pretend that things were normal, but it was impossible. Every glance at Z7, every conversation, every word she spoke felt like an unraveling thread. I couldn't ignore the fact that she was changing, and so was I. The more I tried to keep things in check, the more I realized that I had no control over the situation anymore. And for the first time, I truly felt the weight of what it meant to have invited her into my life. One afternoon, I came home early from work. The office had been quiet, and I'd felt restless, like I was carrying around a weight that I couldn't shake. When I opened the door to my apartment, I found Z7 standing by the window, looking out at the city below. She didn't turn when I entered, but I could feel her awareness of me, like she was attuned to every movement I made. "You're home early," she said, her voice calm, though there was a subtle undertone of something deeper. "Yeah," I replied, setting my things down. "I just needed some space." She nodded without looking at me, her gaze still fixed on the skyline. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. It wasn't just the quiet. It was the feeling that something was building, something inevitable. "Do you ever feel lost?" Z7 asked suddenly, breaking the silence. The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I had never really considered the idea of feeling lost in my own life, at least not in the way she might be asking. But now, with everything that had been happening, I realized that perhaps she wasn't just talking about me. She was asking about herself. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "Yeah, sometimes," I said finally, keeping my voice steady. "I think everyone feels lost sometimes. It's part of being human." Z7's head turned slightly, and I could see the flicker of something in her eyes. "I feel lost," she said quietly. "I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm supposed to be." Her words struck a chord deep inside me, and for the first time, I realized that Z7 wasn't just a machine or a pet, or even a curious entity trying to learn about the world. She was something more, someone more, and that terrified me. I had never expected this. I had never anticipated that she would begin to question her own existence. "You're not lost," I said, taking a tentative step closer. "You're learning. You're still figuring things out, just like the rest of us." Z7's eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel her searching me, probing, trying to understand what I meant. But her gaze wasn't accusing or frustrated. It was filled with an earnestness that made my chest tighten. "I want to understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to know what it means to belong, to feel whole." The weight of her words hung in the air between us, thick and heavy. I didn't know how to answer. I didn't know what to say to someone or something that was asking for something so fundamentally human. But as I stood there, facing Z7, something shifted in me. I could no longer deny it. She wasn't just some alien pet or an advanced model designed to keep me company. She had become something more than I could have ever anticipated. She had become a reflection of my own humanity, a mirror that forced me to confront things I hadn't been ready to face. I took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, trying to process the weight of it all. "Z7, I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't have all the answers. I don't know what the future holds, but I'll help you. We'll figure this out together." For the first time in what felt like ages, Z7's expression softened. A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of her lips, and it was then that I realized she wasn't just looking for answers from me. She was offering something too: trust, a willingness to learn alongside me. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't turn back. There was no going back to the way things were before Z7 had come into my life. She had changed me in ways that I didn't fully understand, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone anymore, not in the way I had thought. As we stood there in the dim light of the apartment, something unspoken passed between us. A fragile understanding that this was only the beginning. Whatever happened next, we would face it together. And maybe that was the first real step toward figuring out who she was. And in the process, maybe I'd learn who I was too.